Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to Lecture 5 in the Politics of Religion. In the last lecture we examined some of the links around religion and morality, and I ended that particular class by suggesting that there could be a naturalistic explanation for the links around religion and morality. And in today's class, I'm going to sort of expand on this a little bit more. And so today's lecture is all about the possible origins and the spread of religious ideas. And this, without any further ado, is the plan. If the slides decide to work. Maybe we have to click on it. There we go. Okay, so this is the plan. I want to talk about zombie ants. The most hated woman in America, a literal man with a spike through his head. What other lecturer is going to give you a man with a spike through his head? Ladies and gentlemen, life on Mars and superstitious pigeons. And if you don't like any of this, I don't know what else to say, right? This is all I've got to give to you. And this is basically, I'm going to be going through all of these different things. And I'm going to be throwing out quite a lot of stuff in your direction today. And some of it, maybe quite a lot of it, will be unfamiliar to you. Don't worry if some of this goes over your head, because we will be unpacking it in a bit more detail when we get to the seminars after reading week. It is also, just to flag this up, by the way, a bit of a Marmite topic. Some people really love this stuff and they get really into it. Other people sit there and think, what the hell is this? This is like the worst thing I've ever encountered in my life. So if you fit into either of those categories, then that's perfectly normal. So this is the plan, and we begin with the idea that religion potentially works as a meme. This has been an idea that's fairly popular in recent years, particularly from, and I keep bringing these people up, we'll get onto them in a few weeks, the new atheists, right? This is one of their big critiques of religion, that religion is a meme and we shouldn't take it seriously. And the idea of a meme was invented by Richard Dawkins. It was in his book, The Selfish Gene, in which he was describing the way in which non-biological information can be passed from one human brain to another. And he coined this idea of a meme, which he said here is a unit of cultural transmission or a unit of imitation. A slightly more involved definition from the Oxford English Dictionary describes a meme as an element of a culture or a system of behaviour passed from one individual to another by imitation or other non-genetic means. In other words, a meme is a pattern of cultural information that is copied and transmitted from one mind to another through a process of imitation. Right now, we all kind of know what memes are, obviously, because we sort of see them on a day-to-day basis, but you need to kind of break it down into this sort of technical level in order to make the connections to religion, right? It's basically ideas that are copied, transmitted between human brains through processes of imitation. And the idea that religion works as a meme is usually seen in a very negative sense. Religion in this formulation acts as some kind of parasite or a mind virus. The idea of religion as a mind virus is very sort of common in new atheist circles. And the argument here is that religion or religious ideas sort of infect their host by they circumventing the rational faculties. They then make people behave in unusual and harmful ways, take up lots of their time, take up lots of their resources, even in some cases may cause physical harm, may induce bizarre forms of behaviour, things like this. And then they also try to spread themselves as far as possible, which anyone who's had a knock on the door in the afternoon from a couple of old ladies from the Church of Latter-day Saints will be able to attest to. Now, a good example of this kind of thing in nature is this, which you should all recognise because, The Last of Us, right? I mean, The Last of Us is one of the greatest things of all time. And if you, I don't mean the TV show. TV show was all right. The Last of Us 2, I've really tried to like The Last of Us 2, but I've come to the belated conclusion that it's just bad. So you can ignore The Last of Us 2, I think. But if you haven't played The Last of Us, the original game, then you owe it to yourself to have played at least once. It is one of the most fantastic experiences that you can have. And this is the basic idea, right? So this is the fungus, which is called, which a version of this appeared in the game, right, called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. And this is found in nature, and it's found particularly in the case of ants. And how it works in the case of ants is the fungus infects the poor little insect, which then obviously is driven out of its very, very tiny mind, admittedly, but driven out of it nevertheless. And the ant then climbs to the top of the tallest tree that it can find in the forest. This is the way the fungus changes its behaviour, at which point the fungus then sprouts, as you can see, from the ant and spreads its spores across the forest floor, thereby spreading itself even further. And so this is the basic idea, right, in terms of how memes work in the case of religion. It's a similar sort of process. As P.Z. Myers, who was originally at least one of the new atheists before he sort of denounced the entire movement, puts it, religion is a parasite of the mind that makes people do stupid things and think stupid thoughts, and so on, and so on, and so on. I won't go through the whole quote, but the slides are available already on Moodle, so if you want to kind of catch the whole thing, then you can just go and download them from there. So this is basically the idea then of religion as a meme, and this is kind of how it works. Right now, critics of this idea highlight several problems with this meme analogy, and one is that the idea of a meme tells us very little about the underlying processes by which ideas get transmitted. It simply says ideas get transmitted, and they do this through processes of imitation, which, okay, well, that's fine, but there's a bit more to it than that, right? Because you need to, and particularly when you're talking about religion, you need to put things in we need to understand the psychological processes involved, we need to understand the political, the social, the cultural dynamics that are involved in all this. Simply saying it works on the basis of imitation, I mean, that doesn't sort of get you very far as a detailed explanation, right? And if we were to go back, I mean, nobody can tell, for instance, which memes are going to go viral, right? I mean, if we knew that, then the corporations would pay billions for that sort of knowledge. So we don't know how memes work in practice. And if we were to rewind the clock in the case of religion, say we could all get in sort of Doctor Who's TARDIS, right, and go back, just over 2,000 years, and then restart human history from that point, would Christianity turn out to be the world's largest religion? Well, probably not. Who knows, right? There are so many intervening variables in that process that it's by no means a given that a particular outcome is the only outcome that can possibly happen. So even in the case of religion, trying to work out how these things work is very, very difficult. And all of this is interesting politically for reasons that we've already discussed in the seminars, but I'm just going to sort of underline it here again, which is that, we like to imagine ourselves as human beings, as being sort of rational, free-willed, autonomous individuals, and we somehow think that our thoughts and our beliefs and our values and everything else, belong to us, that there is a little me sort of floating around inside our heads that has access to and owns all of these particular things. But as we know from certain examples in our seminars, this isn't how human beings actually work. We don't go through life making decisions on a rational cost-benefit analysis. I mean, sometimes you might, if you're going to buy a new home or you're going to buy a car or something, you might sit down and map out the different possibilities. But generally speaking, that's not what we as human beings do. We don't go through life, as a general rule, making decisions on hard-nosed, black and white, rational decision-making processes. We make decisions for non-rational, intuitive and emotional reasons, and then the rational part of our brain kicks in to tell us that the thing we've decided to do was the right decision all along, even though we may have had very little to do with that decision-making process itself. And all of this is really interesting because the extent to which something like the choice of religion or non-religion is a free choice is debatable. And this is quite interesting in the case of religion, because, when you think about it, religion is, the fate of your eternal soul, meaning of life and everything else. It's very hard to think of anything more important than religion or non-religion. This is the most ultimate belief you can possibly have. And so the idea then that this might not be a completely free choice, and we might not have arrived at our religion, whatever it may be, or our non-religious viewpoints, independently of our circumstances, can sometimes feel a bit strange. And this has all kinds of political implications for things like secularism, issues around free speech, issues of religious freedom, debates around faith schools, and so on and so forth, all of which, again, we are going to encounter as we go through the module. So in order to unpack all of this, we need to examine some of the sociological variables that are involved in the spread of religious ideas. And here, there are a number of significant factors at work. One of the main processes here is socialization. And this is the way in which members of a society are inculcated into the norms and the values of that society, typically through processes like, ideas that are passed through the media or the education system, for example. This is how an individual kind of gets to the sense of who they are and the values of the society in which they live in. And in respect of religion, there are three main factors of socialization at work. The first of these is the impact of peer groups. This is, the sort of social networks that you're involved in, the kind of friends you have, the people you hang out with, the general ties that somebody has to a particular religion, whether it's just people that they know or whether it's formal involvement in a particular organisation. And that was dramatic. And one of the main reasons why people lose their religion, for instance, is when these religious links become weakened, when their socialization, when their peer group networks become broken down, or they become sort of watered down in various different ways. So, for example, if somebody stops attending a place of worship, let's say there's a global pandemic, for instance, and then they're cut off from attending their place of worship, and they might, over a period of time, start to conclude that actually I had other things to do on the weekend. They might not start to, drift back to their religion. They might lose it that way. One of the more common ways in which people lose their religion is through going to university, right? Typically what happens here is people have close religious links in their hometown. They leave their hometown, they go to university, they meet people from all different backgrounds, all different kinds of beliefs, and this tends to relativize their worldview and their values, and then people then start to drift away from their religious beliefs. This is a big predictor, the peer groups you have is a big predictor of the kinds of religious beliefs that you're going to have. Another big predictor of a person's religious views is whether or not their parents were religious. And one of the general and wholly unsurprising things, actually, in the literature, is that children who are raised in religious families, shock, horror, turn out to be more religious than children who are raised in less religious families or, non-religious families, right? Now this, you might kind of come across this and go, that just seems really obvious. That's not necessarily, it's not rocket science there, and that's fine. But this is one of the biggest predictors that we have as to whether or not somebody is going to be religious. You look at their parents and the extent to which their parents thought religion was an important factor in their life. Okay, that's pretty obvious. But more interestingly than this is you can actually drill down into this data. And what studies have also found is that a child who is raised by parents from different religions, when the parents have more or less the same attachment to religious beliefs, the child is more likely to grow up belonging to the religion of the mother than the father. So we can even break it down in terms of this sort of fine-grained level in terms of the impact of parental religiosity. Obviously, this doesn't work in every case, and this, you may have heard of this woman, I don't know. This on the right is Madeleine Murray O'Hair, and she was the founder of an organisation known as American Atheists, and she successfully led the campaign to have prayer in public schools in the United States banned in the 1960s, for which she was described by Life magazine as the most hated woman in America. So she had pretty strong views on the subject of religion. It was fair to say. On the left-hand side is her son Bill. Bill is interesting here because Bill did not grow up to be an atheist, as you might imagine from all the evidence I've just given you. But Bill, in fact, turned out to be a Christian pastor, and is now one of the people at the forefront of the campaign to put prayer back into public schools in the United States. So it doesn't necessarily work in every single example, but in most cases, as a sort of general rule, the religiosity of your parents is a really big predictor of your religiosity or lack thereof. A third key factor in religious socialization is the country that you are raised in. Put simply, if you're raised in Saudi Arabia, you're likely to grow up to become a Muslim. If you're raised in Texas, you're likely to grow up to become a Christian. If you're raised in Slough, then you're just unlucky. There's nothing one could do about that. Although actually saying that, weirdly, Slough, for some reason, does actually have one of the highest preponderances of atheists in the United Kingdom. So maybe there's something about Slough that just makes atheists, I don't know. We would have to do some more research into that particular topic. But those are the top three, right? The country you're born in, the parents you have, and the peer groups that you hang around in. Put those three things together, that's a really, really strong predictor of whether or not a person is going to be religious and which religion they belong to. There are a few other sociological factors I'm just going to quickly run through. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. There are some others that I'm skipping out for time reasons. But three others that I'm just going to go over very briefly are race and gender and age. And in the case of race, this is quite interesting because much of the discussion around race and ethnicity tends to focus on the political factors, right? So it will be, for example, the role of religion in establishing community identities, right? Often prominent for minority, racial and ethnic groups. And one reason for this is often floated in terms of a thing called the worldview defense thesis. And this is where groups of people may feel that their culture and their identity would be threatened by assimilating into a different group, so they tend to stick together more closely to try to reproduce and keep their own particular culture going. Often find this also, by the way, in English pubs in Spain, for example. So you can find this in sort of a political sense. But this dynamic can also have a strong effect on religiosity, because being a member of a racial group overlaps quite strongly, not always, obviously, but it overlaps quite strongly with being a member of a particular religious group. And there's lots of evidence from Europe, for example, to show that migrant communities and ethnic minority groups tend to have higher levels of religiosity than the host population. And this is something that obviously gets certain groups of people very excited. You may often see them sort of staggering around town, 2 o'clock in the Saturday morning, waving flags about, trying to stick them to a lamppost and all the rest of it. So you can find these sorts of debates in certain kind of, right-wing circles which we will talk a bit more about in the lecture on demographics, right? This is the sort of, immigrant populations have higher birth rates than the host population, and it's ultimately going to lead to the takeover of the country or whatever. You can sort of find those sorts of more bizarre interpretations of this, but it is generally true to say that immigrant communities do have higher levels of religiosity than the host population. But the thing is, by the time you get to the third generation in immigrant communities, the levels of religiosity are dropping off quite markedly, and in many cases, broadly speaking, it's more or less around about the average of the host population. So it's not like these levels of religiosity just sort of automatically and magically sustain themselves in a society that may not be particularly religiously minded, as in the case of the UK. In addition to this, religiosity is also gendered. Now, I'm going to talk more about this later in the module, because there is a whole lecture dedicated to this particular topic, but I just want to float one interesting thing up now, which is that women tend to be more religious than men. Now, this gap isn't huge it's around about 2 to 3%. But globally, of course, this amounts to quite a lot of people, and it is noticeable, and we find it in every country of the world, right? This is a sort of general universal law of religiosity, and there's no single explanation for this. Some people focus, for example, on biological factors, and one of the arguments here is that, well, men have more testosterone than women. Testosterone is more linked to risky behaviour, and it's more risky, culturally maybe in some places, but historically speaking certainly, to be non-religious, therefore men are more non-religious than women. Now, I'm not saying that's a good argument, but it's an argument that is sometimes made. Others focus on the social roles that women have. So, for instance, you'll find explanations that will say, well, women tend to have more, caring roles in society, or they have roles in society that mean that they're more involved in sort of, dealing with suffering and all that kind of stuff, right? So they're more likely for those reasons to want to adopt a spiritual worldview to make them feel better about things or to find some kind of comfort in life, and that's the reason for it. Now, okay, that's not a great argument either, but there are different takes on this. Basically, and I think this is sort of the most interesting part of this actually, nobody really knows why women are more religious than men. It's just one of those things that's out there and seems to be universally true, and we don't know why. But there you go. There is a gendered nature to religiosity as well. And then finally here is the case of age, which I think we've already mentioned in seminars previously, but this is the sort of general finding, that older people tend to be more religious than younger people. And you can see this in this data from Pew. The orange countries are the countries where younger people are less religious, which is pretty much most of the world. There are only 2 countries, if you can see them, you might have to squint, in light blue, where older people are less religious than the younger people, and that is, I think, Ethiopia and the Congo. And so obviously the explanation here is, as people become older, they become closer to, closer proximity to death. They start thinking about their own mortality more, and this may incline them to become religious. Okay, so there are some key sociological reasons then why people may become religious and how religious ideas may spread from one person to another. But another possibility is that there could be a link between religiosity and the cognitive structures of the brain. And this brings us to the case of Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage was an American railway construction worker in the 19th century, and he became very famous because of an accident that he had. These were the days before, before the woke came along with their health and safety rules, and he had a terrible accident in which, as you can see, an iron spike went through his head. Now, he survived the accident, but people began to notice afterwards that, he wasn't quite the same person after this. He didn't go to parties quite as often. He wasn't the sort of fun-loving, freewheeling, spontaneous individual that he used to be. He was sort of quite withdrawn, pensive and quite sort of depressed about life and so forth, as, naturally he would be. And as a result of all of this, he became a key figure in the developing theories of how different parts of the brain shape people's behaviour. And this premise, of which he was at the forefront, has fed through into research into the possible links between the brain and religion. And this field of research is called the cognitive science of religion. Now, the key idea here is that the human brain, this is where it might get a bit tricky, right? So just buckle up, and if it doesn't make sense, doesn't really matter, we'll go over it again in the seminars anyway. The key idea is that the human brain is not a single unitary system, but consists of different modules, or sometimes described as networks, that have evolved to perform particular tasks. And in the process of performing these particular tasks, these modules create various phenomena that can be put together like Lego bricks to make religion. The cognitive science of religion does not say, which sometimes you might come across this, in sort of media interpretations, it does not say there is a part of the brain, a single part of the brain that makes religion. That is not what they're arguing, right? The general argument is different parts of the brain make different things, and those things can be put together to make religion. So there's like another sort of step in the middle of this process. And at the present time, there are two contrasting views on how this happens. One argues that religion is a byproduct of these cognitive processes. It's an accidental, unintended consequence, a side effect of these different modules, and it has no necessary evolutionary advantages whatsoever. It could, in fact, be detrimental, a bit like, if we're thinking about this in biological terms, it would be a bit like tonsils, or, the appendix. Has no particular evolutionary advantage to having tonsils or appendix. You can simply lose them and have no detriment whatsoever. And in fact, they can be particularly detrimental if it becomes infected, right? So this would be the argument from the byproduct side of the debate, right? Religion as an accidental, unintended consequence of cognitive processes. The second, and I think more popular approach, sees religion as an adaptation. And this claims that religion has had important evolutionary benefits for human society. So again, in biological terms, it would be a bit like, having a liver or a stomach or eyes. These have clear advantages to the biological organism that has them. So one of the key modules from this, from both of these approaches actually, is known as a hyperactive agency detection device, the HADD, the HAD. A hyperactive agency detection device is one of the key modules that people talk about. And this derives from the fact that our brain is hardwired to detect agency in the world, right? Hardwired to detect, people or creatures or agents that are out there doing stuff. And this has obvious evolutionary benefits, right? Because if you imagine our ancestors, right, thousands of years ago, sleeping in the cave at night, and they hear a strange noise outside or at the entrance to the cave, their best bet for survival would be to assume that the strange rustling at the entrance to the cave was some form of agency. If they ignored the noise at the end, if it's kind of rolled over, it's probably just Bob, coming home late at night again or something, right? If they ignored it and it turned out to be a predator, some kind of saber-toothed tiger or something, right, coming into, for a late night snack of its own, then there is a good chance they would have been killed. And then they would not be able to pass on their genes. So assuming that there is agency there, the person then gets up, and if obviously there is a predator or some kind of threat, they can take action to deal with it. So that's pretty obvious, right? But it turns out that there's no real downside to assuming that there is agency, even if there isn't any. There's no downside in this scenario to being wrong. If you imagine that there could be a saber-toothed tiger at the entrance to the cave, and you get up and have a look, and it is just Bob, with his late night snacks, then you just go back to sleep, right? All you've lost here is, a bit of a sleep, right? You'd be a bit tired the next day, and that's it, okay? It's not the end of the world. So there's no penalty for false positives in this particular context. And so because of this, the argument goes that our brains have evolved not just a trigger for agency, but a hair trigger for detecting agency. And this is what makes it not just an agency detection device, but a hyperactive agency detection device. Our brains will detect agency in the world even when it doesn't exist. And this is the reason why we see things like faces in the clouds, or we see faces on the surface of Mars. This is a famous photograph taken by the Viking 1 orbiter in 1976, showing a top-down photograph of a rock formation on the surface of Mars. And you cannot look at that and not see a face, because our brains are hardwired to detect faces. And this is how the argument goes. Our brains are hardwired to detect agency in the world. That's one of the key modules. I'm going to give you another one. These are the two main ones that come up. The second one here is a module called the theory of mind. And this is to do with our awareness of mental states in the world. And so our experience of being alive, and everybody in this room will have this same experience, is that we exist as an independent mind in the world. Every single person on the face of the planet experiences themselves in this way. And we assume, naturally, that other people, and maybe certain animals, like if you're, gorillas, maybe dolphins and so on, right, will have minds that are similar-ish to our own. And so as we go through our daily lives, our brains are constantly classifying the world, making inferences about people's intentions and their desires and their moods, right? You'll be thinking, if you're talking to somebody, your brain will be going, are they happy? Are they sad? Are they upset? Are they angry? Are they bored? Whatever it is, right? Our brains are constantly just scanning our environment, making all of these different inferences. And this is all embedded within a wider ontological categorization of the universe, by which I mean particular objects are believed to behave in particular ways. So, for example, material objects are visible, right? You don't get invisible rocks or invisible trees. Material objects are visible. That's a categorization of how things in the universe work. People can't fly, right? Birds can fly, bats can fly, people can't. The category of people also belongs to the category of things that can't fly, okay? Dead things don't come back to life. Minds only belong to complex living organisms, right? They don't belong to inanimate objects. Rocks don't have minds. Clouds don't have minds. Trees, MAGA supporters, right? All of these things don't have minds. Only people and maybe certain other animals have them. This is all we all kind of get this, right? Because we are all alive. However, the interesting thing here is that in the process of scanning the universe and making all of these different inferences, which happens multiple times a second, right? We don't have to put any energy into this. Our brain just does it. And in the process of doing this, our brains make occasionally things that are called counterintuitive concepts about the world. And these are ideas where the normal rules of reality get broken. And so because our minds are constantly churning up ideas, they might occasionally come up with an idea that doesn't actually make any sense, right? So the idea of a mind that can exist after death does not make any sense, because as far as we know, minds do not exist after death, because minds belong to people. Dead people don't come back to life. Therefore, the trail of logic is that minds don't survive death. Or another one would be rocks don't have magical powers, right? Because as far as we know, only wizards have magical powers, not actual rocks. So anyway, normally these sorts of ideas get just rejected immediately by the brain as just being nonsense, right? Not even worth entertaining, and we're probably not even aware that we've had them, right? They'd just be bubbling away in our subconscious. But sometimes a counterintuitive concept is catchy enough and interesting enough that it can survive and it can start to spread like a meme. So how might something like this happen? Well, in order to answer this, we have to go back to World War II and to a very famous experiment conducted by a psychiatrist called Burrhus Skinner. And this test involved putting pigeons in a cubicle, and then at completely random intervals, a piece of food would drop into the cubicle where the pigeon was. And what Skinner found was that although this happened at completely random intervals, the pigeon would tend to repeat the behavior that it was doing just prior to the food turning up. So if the pigeon, for example, had, just turned anti-clockwise, or had pecked the floor, or had just, scratched itself, or just done something, doesn't matter, whatever it is, and then a piece of food turned up, the pigeon would tend to repeat the behavior that it did before the food just arrived. Now, the really interesting thing here is if another piece of food then arrived completely at random, This would then reinforce the idea to the pigeon that the pigeon had caused this thing to happen, and the pigeon would then start to reproduce this behavior again and again and again until another piece of food, completely at random, but unbeknownst to the pigeon, would turn up. And the pigeon would then start to get a map of causality in which doing particular things makes items of food magically appear. In other words, these pigeons would start to develop rituals to try to control their behavior. Now, in many ways, these findings replicated a different study, which is also really interesting. This was conducted during the First World War by an anthropologist called Bronislaw Malinowski. And his research focused on a small number of islands in the Pacific. And what he found, he went out there and he was studying basically how people lived and, all that kind of anthropological stuff, right? And what he discovered was that the islanders would perform what would be described as superstitious rituals, right? When they performed tasks that were considered to be dangerous. And one of the tasks here was fishing. Because fishing is, you go out on a boat and if the weather turns bad, you obviously can be in trouble, right? And it's more risky the further out you go, and it's more risky the longer you stay out for. And what Malinowski found was that these rituals that were performed to protect the people going out fishing would last for longer, and they would be more intense, the more dangerous the fishing activity became. In other words, the idea was that the performance of these superstitious rituals was again designed to try and control the environment in which these people found themselves. So, to bring this all back to the idea of cognitive science, of religion stuff, it's possible that a counterintuitive concept, like a rock that has magical powers, could catch on to a human brain if it was considered to have some kind of practical use. Okay, now research has also found, in the case of counterintuitive concepts, that the most catchy ones are called minimally counterintuitive concepts. And these are ideas that have just one or two exceptions from reality, right? Ideas, to put it in the context of religion, like somebody curing someone through a miracle, right? Or a virgin birth, or the idea that a person can come back from the dead. Those things just have one exception to the normal way of reality, right? Minimally counterintuitive ideas work like this because A, they're catchy, because you'd go, that's interesting, right? A virgin birth, how could that work, right? And then the process would kind of kick on. They're weird and interesting ideas. We don't normally run into them. But they're also more memorable than maximally counterintuitive ideas. The idea of a virgin birth is way more interesting and memorable than the idea of a dog who will grant you 3 wishes on a Wednesday afternoon if you turn around anti-clockwise at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening while standing on your head, right? Those have lots and lots and lots of different parts to it, and that idea is just impossible to remember, not particularly interesting, just seems a bit outlandish, quite boring actually, right? Minimally counterintuitive ideas, just 1 or 2 exceptions, can be quite interesting and easy to remember, and that's how they can catch on. This is also why, by the way, I think, this is my theory of superheroes, they only ever have 1 or 2 exceptions, right? You don't get superheroes with like a dozen, Superman's got maybe like 6 or something, right? And that's a bit kind of dull, but they don't tend to have like a dozen special powers. They tend to have 1 or 2, right? 3 maybe at the most. And it's the same reason, because these are minimally counterintuitive concepts, and our minds sort of gravitate towards them, right? A superhero that had, a dozen powers is like, okay, whatever, right? Just go away. So this is how it could start to work. And one particular concept that becomes particularly attractive in the case of religion is the idea of what's called a full access strategic agent. Now, the terminology might sound a bit kind of, complicated, but it's actually quite a simple idea. In our normal day-to-day life, again, this is just how we experience the world, we have limited access to the minds of other people, right? unless you're Derren Brown or somebody like this. If you don't know who Derren Brown is, by the way, just go and have a look at his stuff on YouTube. Quite sort of scary abilities that he has. But anyway, most normal people in their day-to-day lives have very limited access to the minds of other people, right? We sort of like to think about whether or not they're interested in what we're saying, or bored, or happy and sad, and everything else that I've mentioned earlier on. But we can't ever get inside another person's head and see what's going on for sure. But it would be really cool if there was something that could. So the argument goes. And this is where we get potentially to the idea of religion. The idea of a full access strategic agent that can see inside everybody's minds at all times, every single day of the week, knows what you're thinking, knows what you're planning, knows what you're up to, knows what you've done. You can see where all this is going, right? This is basically the idea of some kind of godlike figure, and this is how you could possibly get to it, through a process of cognitive evolution. Now, there's no accepted view as to when and how religion emerged. The oldest known representation that we have of a non-existent physical being is this, which is called the Lion Man, from around about 40,000 years ago. And this is, taken to be some kind of representation of a thing beyond our physical world. So that is then taken to be, well, obviously, these kinds of cognitive processes seem to be underway at that point, but we can't be more specific than this. And so a lot of this is sort of speculative, right? But you can imagine that, for example, if one of our ancestors, back thousands and thousands of years ago, discovered a rock formation that looked like a face, and if they had the minimally counterintuitive notion that maybe this rock potentially had some kind of magical powers, and if they appealed to the spirit of the rock to help them out in some way, and if, like Skinner's pigeons, a piece of magical food appeared at that particular point and their life improved, right? Let's say they got better. They were sick and they wanted to get well, and they, became well again through no obvious reason. Or if they had a successful hunt, or if the harvest mysteriously improved. If something happened after they had appealed to the spirit of the magical rock, and then they appealed to the spirit of the magical rock again, and something else, that you can see how this kind of idea could catch on. And this could have been the origins of religious ideas. Now, this then is usually where the byproduct approach to religion ends its explanation. The idea kind of goes, yeah, that's basically how religion could have happened, and it has no advantages to anybody. Religion emerges as sort of, the name says, right, a byproduct, an accidental consequence, cognitive processes misfiring, we get the idea of religion, and that's it. Okay, the end. The adaptation approach, however, goes on to argue that all of this may have had positive effects for the development of human evolution and society. And the basic idea from this perspective is that religion emerged as a way of regulating social order. So early human groups, if we go back thousands and thousands of years, early human groups are very, very small scale, typically tribal groups, and typically in group sizes of between 50 to 150 people. Now, 150 is really interesting here, because this is a thing known as Dunbar's number, named after the professor who came up with it, and it's basically the idea that this is the sort of natural limit of the average human brain in terms of the number of social relationships it can keep track of at any one given time. Like, you can probably remember 5,000 or 6,000 names. If you see faces, you can put names to them, but you can't keep track of that many social relationships, right? So 150 seems to be, some people be a bit higher, of course, a bit lower, but on average, this is about the limit that you can keep track of. And this means that there is a sort of natural limit to group size in our early history, because maintaining social order in that context has to be done on a face-to-face basis. You have to be able to keep track of who you can and can't trust. Like I was saying at the end of last week's lecture about the emergence of morality, if you get a reputation for being somebody who can't be trusted, and you're in a group of this size, you're in big trouble, right? Because nobody's going to want to have anything to do with you. And at this point in our evolution, we're dependent on the group to get by, right? So this is how trust is regulated in early human societies, by these face-to-face interactions. So this is fine, but it does cause a problem if the group starts to get bigger than this, because then it becomes easier for free riders to start to take advantage of the group, and the social cohesion of the group is weakened. So how then do we get from human groups of about 150 to human groups now which literally measured in millions? And one way in which this problem of dealing with free riders and social order might have been resolved is through religion. This was kind of where I ended last week's lecture, with the idea of moral gods, or in the literature called moral high gods, right? And to put this in the cognitive science of religion perspective, a moral high god would be a full access strategic agent that knows everything you're up to, knows everything you've done, can see all your thoughts, and so on and so forth, right? And if that idea is attached to rewards and punishments, then you can see how this could be a very useful way of regulating social order in groups that go beyond this 150 size limit. And research does bear this out, right? This idea of, this is called the supernatural watcher thesis, this idea of a watcher for regulating human behavior is really well established in the psychological literature, right? So, for example, if you have one of these kind of coffee places where it's just help yourself to coffee, and you have a kind of make your own donation, and it's completely free, but you can put some money in the pot at the end of it, right? Then people will, by and large, most people probably take the coffee for free. Some people will make a donation, and you'll get some money out of it, right? But probably not very much. Psychological tests have shown that if you just put a pair of eyes on the wall, probably not googly eyes, but if you just get a pair of human eyes, a photo of a face or something like this, and you stick it on the wall, so the person thinks they're being watched when they're taking the coffee, people will put more money in the pot, even when they don't have to. So this idea of a watcher triggers something very primordial in our brains and makes us behave in particular ways. And we can see this on a sort of bigger scale. These are some figures from Botero et al., making a similar point. And this study looked at 583 societies around the world, and what they found was that the emergence of moral high gods was linked to certain social features. And what they found was that societies that had environmental uncertainty and societies that had a scarcity of natural resources tended to have moral high gods, were more likely to have moral high gods than societies that did not meet this particular criteria. In other words, moral high gods were found in situations where it would have been particularly useful for having a moral high god to maintain social cohesion. Situations where the group is under stresses from the environment and would likely break down if there wasn't a good reason for the group to hang together. And one final point here is that again, this is from the adaptation perspective, the social cohesion provided by moral high gods is usually combined with something called creds. So if you do any kind of reading in this area and you run into a thing called creds, this is what it's talking about, right? Credibility enhancing displays. And this is the idea that religions developed costly and demanding rituals, like rituals involving pain, for example, or rituals involving some kind of sacrifice, whether it's a human sacrifice or an animal sacrifice or giving up money or some kind of resources, right? A costly and demanding ritual would be constructed precisely because, and this is exactly the kind of thing, by the way, that the people at the beginning who go, oh, religion is a meme, and they look at religions and they go, why the hell would religion would religious people behave in that way, right? Giving all your money away, or performing sacrifices, or doing all these kind of weird rituals that make absolutely no sense whatsoever, right? That is taken as evidence of religion being bizarre, making no sense, and this idea of a mind virus infecting the host. But from this perspective, from the cognitive science of religion perspective, the weirdness and the lack of rationality, let's say, on the surface of these rituals is precisely the point. It's precisely the thing that makes them work, because only somebody who was a real believer in that particular religious view would engage in such a ritual, would participate in such a process. And so because they participate in these costly, hard-to-fake rituals, this is a very, very useful way of screening out free riders. And if you screen out free riders, you increase the group cohesion and the chances of the society that you belong in surviving. All of this then, as you should hopefully be ahead of me on this, goes back to the stuff we were talking about in the seminars about strict religions, right? This is basically the same sort of mechanism at work. Now, it's important to bear in mind, by the way, just going to say this to finish off on, some of this stuff is contested. Not everybody goes along with this idea that the cognitive science of religion actually, works in the way I've described today. So we will look at that in a bit more detail in the seminars after Reading Week, but that is it for today. Next time round, we're going to be looking at religious decline and the secularization thesis. But as usual, thanks for coming, and I will see you all later in the week.